So thank you all for coming today. I'm really interested in talking about this subject, about the history of where we live, and specifically about monuments, which are these, right, you've all seen them, there's these big things all over the county that tell us a story. And today I want to, first off, I want to talk a little bit about the monuments here in Sanpete County. First of all, there are a ton, right? And each of them weigh about a ton. And most of the monuments you see walking around here, including one that's just directly that way, about, 150 paces outside of this building, was erected by a group called the Daughters of the Utah Pioneers. And I'm going to focus mostly on their monuments for this section that I'll be speaking on today. There are over 30, when I say DUP, that's just Daughters of the Utah Pioneers, there are over 30 DUP monuments in Sanpete County. There's only about 30,000 people that live here. That's a lot. Also, these monuments tell a story, and they tell a story that's openly and specifically one-sided, right? It's the story of the pioneer settlers. And we're going to talk, and I want to talk about this specifically because I'm a historian, and I like to look at things from different angles. And I want to, in a sense, make an argument today, or maybe not an argument, but maybe ask some questions about the narrative that it runs throughout the DUP monuments. Specifically, right, and I'm going to suggest that these monuments oftentimes either leave out or misrepresent a large portion of the history that these monuments are supposed to be telling. And there are reasons for that, but we're going to do this, and I don't have time to talk about the 30 by any means. I'm going to start with one, but before I do that, I want to mention this narrative that runs throughout DUP monuments all in Sanpete County, specifically relating to the Native American people here. So these are taken from different cities, from these various monuments. On the right, you can kind of see what they look like. You can see the title of it, Indian Massacre. So like, for instance, in my backyard, there is a monument that has quotes that settlers here were, quote, killed by Indians. Another one, Indians drove them out in Spring City. And then another one in Spring City talks about how Indians burnt their chapel, how in Sterling, settlers there were killed by Indians. How, right here in Ephraim, there's one that talks about settlers who were massacred and mutilated by Indians. There's another one in Ephraim that talks about the fort that was built here for the first settlers, a fort that had walls around the area we all go to school, right here at Snow College. The fort was built and specifically says it was built for protection from the Indians. And of course, in Ephraim, again, Indians attacked settlers, pioneers massacred Indians, massacred, mutilated, attacked, needed protection from. These are words over and over again throughout these monuments. And if we read these monuments as a whole, we often have an idea, right, we have a sort of story that's told to us, that the story is pioneer settlers came, Native Americans came and tried to hurt them, and then the pioneers were brave and stayed. I don't think this is the whole story. I don't think this is the whole narrative. And we don't have time today to kind of go through everything. But I do want to point out one story that matters, I think, to this county, right? Starting with the founding. The very first, so I just made a slide here. The very first DUP monument, so Daughters of Utah Pioneer Monument, is located in Manti. And it talks about the first pioneer settlers to the region, a man named Isaac Morley. And Isaac Morley, and it says here, right, the Manti pioneers under the direction of Isaac Morley, the Bishop Isaac Morley, and it mentions how many pioneers, 224, and then it says the date, 1849. This is one of the first Mormon pioneer settlements outside of Salt Lake City. And then it goes and says that the first pioneers in Sanpete County were here because of an invitation from Indian chief Walker, it says, right? His name is Wakara, right? The pioneers called him Walker. And so Wakara, the understanding is Wakara said, please come and settle in Sanpete County. And so that's how the narrative, I think, starts on a lot of these monuments. However, I was curious because if you look at the bottom of this, this is kind of interesting, right? Pioneers were invited by Chief Wakara. And then at the bottom of the monument, it says, that winter, heavy snow, losses of animals, famine, and serious Indian trouble taxed the settlers. So this is kind of weird in and of itself, right? They were invited by the Native Americans, and then suddenly they were in fights with them. And so I was curious, and what was interesting is Wakara, the person who supposedly invited Isaac Morley and the first settlers in Manti, actually wrote about this. And so he was interviewed in 1853, right, a while ago. And Wakara said this, that he had always been opposed to the whites settling on the Indian lands. Right? He even claimed that his people were much abused, that they had been driven by the population from place to place, that settlements have been made on all of our hunting grounds in the valleys, and the graves of our fathers have been torn up by the whites. A very different narrative than we get from this one. And my goal is not to say which one's right, I think, right, but to understand that there are multiple narratives, multiple ways of viewing the same event. And these people disagree, right? Wakara disagrees with what is written about Wakara a good 100 years later. And I want to continue on a little bit with the Isaac Morley, the first foundation of this region, specifically by looking at a monument from the DUP that's sitting in my backyard. Well, not literally my backyard, but 1 block away from my backyard. This is in Fountain Green, Utah, and it commemorates what is called the Fountain Green Massacre. And this is because right after the first couple years of settlement in Sanpete County, war broke out between the Utes under Wakara and between the Mormon pioneers and settlers in all of the Utah Territory. Right, people were raiding each other's villages, and Isaac Morley in Manti sent four Mormon pioneers to go up to Salt Lake, and he said, do not camp in the area called Uinta Springs. They later changed the name of Uinta Springs to Fountain Green. Do not camp there because we know hostiles are in the region. He said, camp more closer to the location, which is like Chester or Moroni, for those, most of you are familiar with that area. He says, don't go to Uinta Springs. Well, these 4 pioneers said, well, it would save us a whole day's trip if we went all the way to Uinta Springs first. So they don't listen to Isaac Morley. They go all the way to Uinta Springs, and this monument commemorates what happens there. Specifically, they name, by name, James Nelson, William Luke, William Reed, Thomas Clark. They name people and say they were all, quote, killed by Indians. That's all the information we have on this monument. The next line that comes on the monument is more or less like, and later they founded Fountain Green at this spot. But the story is killed by Indians in this spot. And from the time we moved there, this is something I looked at and really thought about deeply. And so I did some research, right? I have a PhD in history. I know how to do historical research, hopefully, a little bit. So I looked up this story and wanted to understand, well, what happened afterwards? What was the response? Well, I found out that Isaac Morley heard about this the very day that it happened, right? People on horseback came up to Manti and said they were all killed. So Morley and a group of Mormon settlers march from Manti, and they get all the way to the town in Nephi. So they go all the way through the canyon to Nephi. They find the bodies, they bury them in Fountain Green, and they get to Nephi, and we have some of these primary sources, right, what the historians like to look at. This is a journal entry up here from a settler in Nephi, right, named Martha Hayward. And Martha wrote in her diary about when Isaac Morley and the Mormons from Manti showed up in Nephi. She says, Father Morley from Sanpete, right, came to Nephi to do quite as barbarous an act. says 9 Indians coming into camp, right, looking for protection and bread, were shot down without 1 minute's notice. And then it says, and then she qualifies this by saying that the Mormons did not know if the Indians, right, were the ones who, quote, did the first evil act. In other words, they had no idea if the people that they just shot and killed had anything to do with the massacre, the violence that happened in Fountain Green, right? Came in, told people, we will feed you. 9 people come in and then shoot them and kill them. Actually, they only shot and killed 7. The other 2 were kept as captive. So this was pretty shocking when I found this. Also, just basic internet research will bring you to a couple headlines from 2007. Right, this is from the Deseret News. And the Deseret News talked about these people, right, Nephi, you guys all know, has been growing rapidly in the last few decades. But people were building a house in Nephi, and they're digging out an area to make a foundation and basement, and they found a whole bunch of human bones. And when you do that, you need to call people, right? So they called the state of Utah. They came out, and they had archaeologists digging up this stuff, and they found the bones of 7 Native Americans that they found. And this is from the Deseret News, right? Church-owned news, LDS church-owned newspaper. It says the remain of 7 American Indians unearthed by a home builder shows several were shot point blank in the head by Mormon settlers seeking revenge during a period of pitched violence in 1853. Say scientists who plan to release their findings today. Right, so this doesn't come up for about 150 years after the actual event. We have the bones. Okay. So this is, in a sense, the end of one of the many stories we could tell, maybe about with monuments, but then also adding other primary sources, other information that we can dig up to maybe tell a more rich and maybe unsettling story about where we live. Right? And I'm not going to provide like answers, maybe, but what I'll do is I'll give you guys some questions. First, right, are there ways that we can maybe change the way that we think about history and monuments? Because I know I take my students to see monuments, and sometimes they read them, like blah, 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 and they just accept that as automatic truth because it's written on a giant piece of metal, right? Are there ways that we can interact differently with these things, think more deeply about them? Can we act in a way to maybe tell a different story? Can we learn from problems of the past, and can we add maybe to the narrative that these monuments tell us? So that is all I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to, next, Professor English Brooks is going to talk to you. For those who don't know him, he's an assistant professor at Snow College, as well in English and philosophy. He's taught writing, literature, service learning, interdisciplinary humanities, ESL, all here at Snow since 2005. He studied at the University of Utah and the University of Nevada in Reno, where his emphasis has been in environmental humanities. And this afternoon, he's looking forward to sharing some recent experiences, collaborating with colleagues, friends, family, and students, looking at these local monuments and interacting with them. And me and English have been also working together on trying to make a collaborative project to look at these monuments. So give a round of applause for our next speaker.
Okay, I think it's on. Sounds like it's on. Okay, it's on. Just gonna plug in here. Okay. Yeah, thanks. So as Eric mentioned, I teach in the English department, not a historian, right? So not coming here speaking as a historian at all, but here to talk about these monuments themselves. And like Dr. Freeman, and probably like a lot of you, as long as I've lived in the area, I've been pretty well surrounded by these monuments. And I'm going to, because I don't trust myself to stay on script, I'm going to kind of be reading some of this from some notes here. As long as I can remember, these things have been a pretty familiar and ubiquitous fixture or set of fixtures in the landscape. Walking around town, driving local highways, you see these public monuments along sidewalks and parks and public squares, plazas, street corners, stuff like that, commemorating settler heritage, and each telling and foregrounding some stories of this place while, as Dr. omitting others, leaving others out. If you're familiar with these monuments, you'll recognize some common storytelling tropes or patterns, right, that tend to be pretty consistent. Some of these things are regional histories that begin with colonial expansion and settlement. That's where they begin, is in that moment. A kind of pattern of labor, travail, sacrifice in the people involved. Quite often, perhaps too often, the building of forts, including their dimensions and their dates. A lot of detail there, and the establishment from there on of military order. Sometimes by name. Often you see the word military order or some version of that taking place. The naming, or rather renaming of local places, the enclosure and accelerated conversion of these places into material resources. So that is timber, mines, quarries, mills, foundries, infrastructure, and so on. And we also notice some common structural characteristics. I've just kind of dumped a bunch of them here in kind of a collage, as well as a range of variety of differences between different monuments. Some are more neatly crafted and mortared from like uniformly cut stones, and then others are rougher with quirky materials, maybe that are unique to a certain place. River stones or chunks of ore or volcanic rock, sometimes with other artifacts embedded in them. Back here there was the bell in Mount Pleasant, right? On Main Street there, Mount Pleasant, or on the highway going by. I like this beehive one. This is in Richfield. You guys see the beehive sort of embedded over there on the side. It's kind of unique. These are some of my favorite features, though. I don't think you can beat the Spring Monument in Spring City on the corner of 100 North and Main Street, because there's a spring in it, right? It's always water flowing there. And let's look at a few others, right? Some of these are familiar that we just looked at, Moroni. But I do want to take a little more time with this one, right? It's our closest one, right? Like half of you, depending on which exit you go out, you'll see it right away, right there on College Avenue. So let's consider this one, placed here a little over 50 years ago. First of all, I want to share some things that I like about this one. I even love about this monument and sincerely appreciate 5 things. One, I love the hard work and skill, just as an object. And you can't see it all here because it's kind of cropped in, so you can just see the plaque, but we're familiar with the monument. I love the skill and hard work that's clearly gone into crafting the limestone and building the larger structure. We don't really build things like this anymore, or very uncommonly, and the things that remain like this, I feel, do have a presence that I find meaningful and powerful. I love the Sanpete oolite limestone that was cut locally from a quarry that was once worked by my great-great-great-grandfather. And that's not supposed to be, some kind of flex or something, but like it's meaningful to me, right? It does carry meaning. The plaque also includes the place named Pine Creek. If you can read the text, it says this family came to Pine Creek. I like that that's from a time where the settlement was named or called after local features and not yet after ideas that were imported from someplace else. Also, as a teacher, I especially appreciate the details there towards the end about the community who cared about and believed in the value of learning enough that they used chunks of, I don't know if it was the same oolite limestone or sulfur, some kind of yellow rock, it says, as a kind of crayon or tool to write with when it was all that they could afford. Finally, in a general sense, the monuments remind us, this and others, that there was a precedent to this place, that it wasn't always just asphalt and long grass like I'm talking about out there, right, with the practice field and the road and stuff. Or if you like, more generally, wherever we see them, right, that before there was the Sinclair in Spring City, like before there was a gas station, there was a spring, right? Or you could, whatever you like, a car wash, an Arby's, a parking lot, etc. That there were people here who lived differently from us. Now, on the other hand, there are several things that I find pretty troubling about the monument, and Dr. Freeman kind of pointed to some of these. I'll say specifically to this one, and maybe you find troubling too. We hopefully have a chance to talk about some of this at the end. I find it troubling that it starts the clock on this place's meaning and significance only with the moment of European settlement. That it is only these settlers who have names that are mentioned and individual identities, while Native people who had lived and cared for this place for many, many, many generations are simply lumped as a kind of afterthought in a reference to Indian raids. Also, it states that each man, just kind of quoting from here, each man was allotted 20 acres, omitting the fact that the only people actually referred to here as men were Mormon settlers, and that Native people, who evidently aren't counted among these men, were, of course, not allotted anything. It's also troubling that while the plaque plainly spells out, it's right there, right? It spells out the college's appropriation, or theft, if you like, of Ute lands for its campus. Even now, over 50 years after the monument's placement, this still isn't something openly discussed, I think, in any intellectually honest way, and much less meaningfully addressed on campuses like ours. So Snow's not unique here, but we're part of this larger pattern in terms of college campuses, especially state college, land-grant campuses in the West. And there's a large, I don't know if national, at least regional conversation about this, and we're part of that, or ought to be perhaps. So we've inherited these monuments as part of our built environment. Most of us in this room, we're not around when these were installed, but they do continue to shape, and that is in some ways to better inform, right? But in other ways to significantly distort or limit our understanding of this place, its meaning, its possibilities, and who we are in relation to it and within it. Turns out that there's a word for this, and it's a pretty simple one. There's probably a lot of words, but I think a simple one that is helpful for framing this is just heritage. I'll give you a little bit of background on this and some basic definitions. I want to turn to some geographers. This is from a book from 2000 by these three geographers called A Geography of Heritage, Power, Culture, and Economy. And these authors outline the following premises. First of all, they just say that in the basic sense, heritage is defined as a contemporary use of the past, right? Us in the present using the past. They suggest that when we focus upon the ways in which we use the past now, or upon the attempts of a present to project aspects of itself into an imagined future, then we are engaged in heritage. That if people in the present are the creators of heritage, not merely passive receivers or transmitters of it, then the present creates the heritage it requires and manages it for a range of contemporary purposes. Like many other aspects of modern society, this can be done well or it can be done badly. It can be done for the benefit or at the cost of few or many. We have choices here about how we define or use or practice heritage, I think is another way to put that. They also define heritage as both a cultural and an economic good, and that it is commodified as such. So that's just a way of saying it is, can be packaged, bought, sold, traded on, and so on, monetized, and so on. So not just these writers, but many others have likewise illustrated how heritage also entails a certain kind of dissonance. So dissonance like tensions or even contradictions, maybe. When we talk about heritage dissonance, here's some things we might recognize, and these, again, kind of drawing from those authors, geographers, and historians. Dissonance is an intrinsic quality of heritage, that it's always there in some form. It can be a discordance or lack of agreement and consistency as to the meaning of that heritage. And that heritage dissonance can involve how heritage is perceived and what value systems are filtering those perceptions. One last, I guess, thought. This one's borrowed from on Heritage. A Serbian historian, art historian named Visna Kisic. She suggests that dissonant does not have to mean contradictory. Not in all cases anyway. She said it could also mean unstable, unusual in combination, inconsistent, incompatible, irreconcilable, clashing, or otherwise different. So again, we can do with or in response to that dissonance we experience, or rather, let me put that as a question. This invites us to consider what we can do with that dissonance or tension that we experience, for example, with these kinds of monuments. Let's see. One approach that some of my students and I have taken, and also with the help and collaboration of family, friends, colleagues across campus, people in the local community, has been in the form of some experiments with this medium of blackout poetry. And I'm going to ask for some raise of hands. Who's familiar with blackout poetry? Sometimes it's called redaction poetry or erasure poetry. A few. And probably we've seen it even if we haven't recognized it. Probably we can get the gist even hopefully by looking at this. So blackout poetry is where you start with some already existing text. This can be something well-known, historical, or with literary or historical value. Or it can be just something ordinary, like a newspaper or a magazine. From there, you might cross out certain lines lightly, so they're still partly visible, or you can like heavily redact it, get in there with a Sharpie and just sort of, scrub it out. Sometimes people include drawings or design elements too. In this one, this is basically a copy-paste definition from Wikipedia of redaction poetry. And then sort of, in these other two examples below, starting from that text and drawing other things from it. So the text can mean multiple or different things at once, depending on how visible the text is underneath. So these can result in a kind of, let's see, we'll go to that in a sec, kind of poetic paraphrase of the original text, which is kind of like this one is a little more along those lines, or they might emphasize some kind of rhyme or other pattern in the original, or the technique can be used to strip away and reveal other themes, tensions, or questions present in but also hidden in the original text, or the resulting poem can even depart entirely from the original and point off in some other direction, do something unrelated. These are some examples from class a couple years ago. And I'm trying to see, are there any students of mine or Dr. Freeman's in this class that have been in the classes or in this room where we have worked with any of this? I can't see any, but it's a little dark out there. Okay. So this is your poetry or your classmates' poetry. So with my students, I initially had them reading poems or redacting poems from our course text, some of which turned out to be pretty excellent. I thought these are some good examples. From there, I had a chance to collaborate with my wife, Kelly, who teaches in the visual arts program here at Snow. Some of you may know her. And we tried out a version of this approach with some of our local monuments around Sanpete. And we made a video. I'm going to share the video. It's short. And I think this kind of illustrates it. It's also intended to be kind of a demo, like here's one, here's something you can do. Utah Pioneers, Ephraim Settlement, LDS Church, School, all used Indian land for this spot.
Spring, spring, long may you sing. Ought men enclose land
No Indian enclosed land with a gate in 1854. Utah pioneers stole the entire sacred Sanpete, a soft massacre.
Settlers and war covered the West, the entire occupied West. The animals ran. We killed and maimed. All land is home, all land a grave. Okay, that's pretty much it. So from here, we kind of wanted to, so that was kind of an experiment. That was actually a later iteration of an experiment we started sort of during the second summer after COVID. We were restless. Do you guys remember? We were all trying out new things and looking around our homes and kind of seeing it in new ways and stuff. So some of it kind of came out of that. But sort of a next step was like, well, let's experiment with some of this with our students. How might we get out there with our students and try some similar things? So we kind of tried to bring this form to bear on some of our local monuments. Let's see. So for the past year or so, Dr. Freeman and I have arranged for our classes to coordinate some like walking tours, sometimes around campus, to look at some of these monuments. Again, any hands? Doesn't look like anybody in the room was involved in that, so that was maybe earlier group of students. Anyone work with Amy Jorgensen in visual arts doing this as a student? I know she's done this with some of her classes also, so some of these pictures of her doing similar things with her students. So they did some great rubbings that I'll kind of click through a few of these. From here, I mainly just want to share with you a few examples of these student poems. These are all going to be student poems from here on in these slides, mostly to illustrate all the different directions one might take with this kind of work. And I need to apologize to our folks in the booth there. Not all of these will maybe track exactly with the ones that are in that list there, but hopefully it's close. Let me read some of these. Well, I'll just let you, some of these, I mean, visually too, there's more going on than just the text. There's these little, textural things that they're getting these rubbings off from. I like this one, just kind of like reorienting it also, so it's not exactly linear and there's different ways of ordering or reading those in relation to each other, those words. I know we're kind of going through them quick. Under the direction of the rattlesnake, right? So like we're swapping different characters and roles in the story. Okay, let's see. Settlement came to Utah for Indian land, arrived, ended Indian man. LDS Church allotted acres of land in Utah to pupils. No Indian allotted land, no Indian city allotted, no home for Indian man. Indian home ended, LDS built over families. 77 arrived, LDS Church militia allotted 20 acres of Indian land. All land is a door to the past, and future. The field, fire, the light, the heat. Pioneers arrived, Indian endurance, 100 killed. Engraved over the door in red, all man allotted 20 acres of land. Engraved over the door in red, Indian raids ended. In nearby canyons, Native Americans seek safety from settlers. Men have 7 homes and accommodate for little. LDS Church had city, Indian had rock. I move along with a view of a valley, a green valley. I move along into a reminder of the present. So these are just a few, and maybe, let's see, I want to end on one other statement here. And this I'm borrowing from, there's a writer named Cristina Rivera Garza. This is from an interview she did in a magazine a few years ago. She's a novelist, but also a historian, and does like really thoroughgoing historical research for her fiction and kind of creative nonfiction work. And you don't do this without learning some things about yourself and how you relate to a place and how you relate to the past. And so she had this to say. She says, "There's always something." I'll paraphrase these down briefly, and then we kind of wrap it up. There's always something that has preceded us. This is a question that I ask wherever I go now. If I'm here, how come I'm here? Who is not here so that I can be here? And if we are here because some form of violence is taking place, how can we address the experiences that are relevant not only to the world in which we live, but to the world that we want to create? So I'll leave you with that question, and we'll open things up for discussion and Q&A and stuff. Thank you.
Let's see. Yeah, this works still. We have about 10 minutes for Q&A, maybe a little bit less. TAs will be on either side for those who have questions. So I guess we could start by taking maybe 10 seconds or so to just think if you have any questions about either of our talks, while the TAs kind of separate. So just take a minute to think. Any questions to start out?
Okay, my question is, when and why did y'all become interested in the different monuments in Sanpete County?
Oh, I guess I can start. I think I mentioned earlier, like as a trained historian, right? That's like one of the first things I look at, right? I look around, and one of the most visible like stories being told of history at me, right, just by walking around, was this. That one of the first things I saw. And then I would say the next thing that really interested me was Darren Perry came and spoke at Convocation, I think 2 years ago, who talked about the Bear River Massacre in Idaho of the Shoshone people, and about specifically a Daughter of Utah Pioneers monument that celebrated the massacre of Native peoples. And I was like, holy crap, we have a Daughters of Utah Pioneers. Like I was just, and so for me, after that, I wanted to look at the other monuments and talk to this guy too. But
yeah, I mean, as you're explaining that, I'm thinking, for me, it was kind of, I have to ask myself, why did it take me so long? Like, I've lived here, I've lived a few other places, but I mostly lived in Utah, and they're everywhere. We've been working on some research together on just how these things work in the larger region. So there are over 600 Daughters of Utah Pioneer monuments, mostly in the Great Basin, where we are now, Colorado Plateau, sort of like Utah, Idaho, Arizona, kind of east, west, Nevada, Colorado, and so on. Some of them are back in Europe. There's some in Iceland, and I want to say England and Scandinavia and stuff, I think. So on one hand, I think because of their ubiquity, kind of like I think you said, we kind of take these things for granted. It's sort of like, but they're everywhere, so you don't notice them, right? Or if you notice them, they're just sort of like, the grass or the sky. They seem inevitable or natural or just sort of normal. But you start looking into them, and they're anything but, right? They're very deliberately placed, and they do very specific things to the way we see a place. So once I kind of noticed that, then it was kind of, anyway, that's where I kind of noticed, right? But, some of those things about them and got more interested.
Is it on? Okay, the way that we've talked about history a little bit is just, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's more of opinion based off of facts. And so these monuments are giving off some sort of false reality, maybe? Do you think that is true? Do you think that these monuments are spreading false information, or and do you think there's an issue with that, and how should society go about handling that?
That's a great question, thanks. Well, I think first of all, there's a difference between history and memory. And what I mean by this is, like, the field of history, right, is the idea that you're supposed to look at the sources that exist to try to make up a story. Do we have all of the pieces that are going to make up any story? No, right? It's kind of like a puzzle that's missing half of the pieces. So there's always room for interpretation. However, memory is a little bit different, though. And in the case of the Daughters of the Utah Pioneers, which were founded in 1901, right? So at least 30 years after any of the events they commemorate, right? The goal is not exactly to undertake, right, academic history by any means. They have a specific goal, which is to share one story from one point of view. And they're very openly saying that, right? I mean, the name is and when they were founded in 1901, they openly say, right, we are here to celebrate, right, our pioneer ancestors. And to belong to the Daughters of Utah Pioneers, this might have changed, but you had to kind of prove that you had ancestors that moved to, moved to the area before 1969. And so I guess to answer the question, like, I have a hard time saying, like, history is just, like, your opinion on facts, right? But at the same time, right, it's complicated stuff, because in the case of monuments, there's a big political discussion about monuments, right? Think about, like, monuments of the Confederacy in the South that are commemorating generals who are promoting white supremacy and slavery, right? There are groups that say, right, this is really important. Others that are saying we should tear it down, and they're saying you're tearing down history if you're tearing it down. But in a lot of ways, right, this is a big, like, conversation, and I do think probably the most important thing would be to talk about, like, history versus people remembering something specifically from one side, and so I don't know if that fully answers your question, but I don't know.
So I think I don't really have a question, more of a comment. I thought your presentation worked amazingly great together. I'd be a little biased too, but I also think that, in our society, we're trained at a young age to listen to stories and read stories. And I think we are also not often trained to think deeper about those stories, that they might not be one side, there might be, like, different interpretations, different memories, different experiences going through those stories, and that we could actually learn about the past and the future, and just not just sit down and listen to a story. There is always more, and I think as a parent, when you read stories to your kids, there is just, like, that's the story, period. And we often forget to understand or get curious about these stories to see what it involves and who it involves. And there is also that idea of taking sides, you don't have to take a side. And it's not because you don't foreseeably agree or see or interpret or understand the stories the same way that you are against that. And so I think I really like the fact that there is a need to have a more well-rounded history and understanding of it. And what I really liked about the presentation is that English, you literally showed us this via the monuments through art and through words, that there is more than one interpretation, more than one story behind the story. And so I think it's something, you know, as an academic advisor, I might be biased too, but it's something as college students, it's what college trains you to do, to push your thinking, even though college might be very boring at times, I would say, or you could feel it this way, but I think it's like going through that path where you actually train your mind to actually get more curious about this and make a difference. So yeah.
Do you want to comment on? Oh, yeah.
So the question I had specifically was, is there anything else the Daughters of the Utah Pioneers did, or was it all they did make monuments?
Let's see. I'm not a very great person to ask, but like I know they do restoration work on like local buildings and stuff. There was a great presentation at the last Scandinavian Heritage Days about the Hansen House. Mike, is that what is that the house? Right over there behind the Maverick and stuff. I know they do that. Last time I was on their webpage, there was some royalty. I think they sort of award scholarships and things. I don't know much about that. For me, like the most visible thing I see is the monuments, but other stuff they do, or
yes. And in fact, like in the early 1900s, their biggest projects were actually collecting local histories from all the pioneers.
and things, right?
Yeah,
in a lot of these towns, yeah.
Multiple volume series of stories about Utah pioneers, which are pretty amazing. And they have the best title ever. It's called Heartthrobs of the West.
That's right.
Right? And Kate Carter, who's one of the presidents of the Daughters of the Utah Pioneers, like brought together thousands of really amazing stories. So I don't want to be like trashing on the Daughters of the Utah Pioneers, because they actually do a lot and bring up like a conversation that I think needs to happen. But yeah, so they actually are extremely active heritage society. I think we're time, yeah. So if you guys have more questions, please stick around. I don't know if you have to run off, but we should be around here. Otherwise, if you need to go, thank you, and maybe give a round of applause to this guy, not me so much.